some indeed is somebody recording the, yeah, I just got a,
Yes, that's not an issue. We are just recording the meeting.
yeah, it's
Sorry to
fine.
interrupt. Please
Yeah,
start.
it's, no, 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 no. Right. So there is indeed, as I said, an objective space, that the earth revolved around the sun. And in this constitution of an infinitely open space, there's like one little square footage that we have objectively, come to know. And this destabilization of hierarchy also brought as a corollary the fact of the universe's non-homocentric spatialization. So the change of spatialization is also simultaneously happening. So one is the obvious, colonization project, while the other, despite of what the West is espousing at that point of time, where it wants to consolidate its hierarchies and it wants to appropriate scientific and rationalist principles. On the other hand, it is also turning on its head. And the expansionist model of the city also came to embody this power structure, right? So on one hand was this center-periphery relationship. On the other hand, people from the periphery were constantly coming to the center because they were also now empowered with languages, they were empowered with travel. So the city was no longer perceived as a place of privilege, as Foucault says. It is an exception in a territory of fields, forests, and roads, but they were no longer islands beyond the common law. Instead, the cities, with the problems that they raised and the particular forms that they took, served as models for the government's rationality that was to apply to the whole territory. So, despite themselves, sort of, they created a space where everybody was equal. They created a space where, different voices and different peripheral beings could converge, and the utopic idea of, this ideal space was finally beginning to take shape, etc. So this narrativization and constructedness also gives rise to the myth of utopia, which again, is greatly influential in the aesthetic of the city, the aesthetic of the space in narratives, the space in literature of these various bioscapes, as Michel de Certeau calls them, right? In his brilliant and seminal Walking in the City. Right. So this flattened two-dimensional thing that was supposed to consolidate the colonial project suddenly became this absolutely disruptive and very, very epistemic space where you could be just on your foot and explore, and these labyrinthine streets and rivers and spaces that are public in nature. It comes into your view as another picture altogether that is not described just by maps when you go in and out of the city. Its urbanity is the preeminent condition of spatial existence that evolved all throughout modernity, right? So, on the other hand, the development of these industrial zones, industrialization, saw this space rapidly filling with people, as we were saying, that, people from the peripheries, even now, migration is a very real thing, because migrants are trying all over the world to reach urban centers. India, neighboring states has people coming to Calcutta, to Delhi, for work. It see this as many nation states foreign policies. Brexit happened because one of the reasons that Britain put forward was that they could not deal with migration. So more and more of these of the other side of postmodern speciality seems to have developed by the end of modernity, things that actually heralded postmodern speciality as a whole. So on the other hand, the psychopathologies of urban existence, its attendant inertia, anxieties, fears, turning the city space into one of gangrenous criminality, often state atrocities. So, also the senior side of urbanity, etc. These are also coming to create a heterogeneous space laced with multiplicity and existential trauma. And this trauma, I'm going to argue, is one of the central points of the turning of modern fiction into the post. Right. So Zygmunt Bauman has a very significant essay where there is this small portion I'm going to quote. I love this, description, especially, and as I quote, the city is the site of pleasure and danger, of opportunity and threat. It attracts and repels and cannot do one thing without doing the other. The city breeds excitement and fatigue, offering on one tray tidbits of freedom and enemas of disempowerment. The modern promise to purify the crystal of pleasure and drain off the contaminating impurities failed to materialize, while the zealous postmodern attempts to act on that promise to forcing urban life into a reason-dictated frame and prohibiting everything that the design has not made obligatory only added new artificially produced functions to the old spontaneously emerging lines. So we are already anticipating postmodernity here because of this significant traumatic technologies that compressed spatial topologies in a far more significant proportion. And we note, am I cut off? Or it says that the internet connection is a bit unstable.
Not at
No,
all.
ma'am,
You can all hear me? Okay. So sorry to have stopped. Anyway, so I'm going to hearken for a second on Marshall McLuhan, who came up with this, very infamous term, global village. And while he may not have, intended to become as infamous, I think David Harvey did it a far more, did it far more justice and explained how, and I'm quoting David Harvey here, after 3,000 years of explosion by means of fragmentary and mechanical technologies, the Western world is imploding. During the mechanical ages, we had extended our bodies in space. Today, after more than a century of electronic technology, we have extended our central nervous system itself in a global embrace, abolishing both space and time as far as our planet is concerned. This is an extremely significant feature of postmodernism. Because since 1970, satellite communication systems have reduced the unit cost of communication over vast distances. This, in addition to the freight rates, which have undergone dramatic reduction, more than anything, has caused lightning fast telecommunication, and swift satellite images can be near simultaneously viewed all across the world, right? And Harvey is one of the first scholars to actually understand what this might do to the age of space, as Foucault calls it. I'm going to quote Foucault a little bit later, and but first I need to go through Harvey. And Harvey talks about technologies so as to make us understand how spectacular the spatial compression is. That the age of internet and telecommunication has rendered time differences across spatial barriers absolutely non-existent, right? So this annihilation of space, Harvey says, is already been one of the mainstays of both capital ideology and the theory of late stage capitalism, which is postmodernism, right? I'm going to quote Harvey once more. And he says, the collapse of spatial barriers does not mean that the significance of space is decreasing. Not for the first time in capitalism's history, we find the evidence pointing to the converse thesis. Heightened competition under conditions of crisis has coerced capitalists into paying much closer attention to relative locational advantages, precisely because diminishing spatial barriers give capitalists the power to exploit minute spatial differences to good effect. Small differences in what the space means to enforce, speed up and redefinition of skills on recalcitrant workforces, geographical mobility and decentralization are used against a union power which traditionally concentrated on the factories of mass production. Now, I don't need to, remind you how much this is related to postmodernism. So not only rapid industrialization, but the absolute annihilation of any kind of time-space barrier. And the more spatial barriers diminish, the more we are sensitized to what the world spaces contain. So in postmodern societies, late capitalism has ushered in an era where flexible accumulation typically exploits a wide range of seemingly contingent geographical circumstances, as Harvey argues. And this has resulted in an inevitable recursive and serial monotony as well, because every space is like every other space because of large scale expansion of the same businesses all over the world. And with the disintegration of the individual speciality that once remained outside the conforming spheres of colonialism, including local ecologies, habitats, means of production, small or medium industries, languages, or even means of communication, the world is now full of spaces that are identified and articulated by exactly the same signifiers, which are invariably logos and brands of big businesses. So this finally takes us into what we are expecting from postmodern space. That is the space of the simulacra, resembling a copy of a copy for which there is no original. The speciality of the postmodern is the opposite of the utopic space, from where it actually comes from. It comes from the, via the utopic space, but that it initially imagined itself to be. But it becomes somehow a space of mise en abîme frames, a city of nightmares within nightmares, a space of urban dystopia instead of the utopic space that it imagined itself to be, right? So the spatial turn, to understand what it entails, I'm going to take recourse to, two people largely. One is Jean Baudrillard, and the other is Michel Foucault, and the writer who puts them both together, Italo Calvino. And obviously, there's a lot to learn from each of them, but I'm going to start with Jean Baudrillard's quotation in The Precession of Simulacra, where he's talking about the postmodern tendency of spatial simulation, right? I quote Baudrillard, abstraction today is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor survives it. Henceforth, it is the map that precedes the territory, the precession of simulacra. It is the map that engenders the territory. And if we were to revive the fable today, it would be the territory whose shreds are slowly rotting across the map, the desert of the real itself. And I'm going to follow this up with Michel Foucault's quotation from Of Utopias and Heterotopias, where Foucault says, I quote, "The present epoch will perhaps be, above all, the epoch of space. We are in the epoch of simultaneity. We are in the epoch of juxtaposition, the epoch of the near and far, of the side by side, of the dispersed. We are at a moment, I believe, when our experience of the world is less that of a long life developing through time than that of a network that connects points and intersects with its own scale. As a sort of simultaneously mythic and real contestation of the space in which we live, this description could be called heterotopology." So this is where we actually come down to how postmodern space has morphed into a ghost of the spatial turn, how it has morphed into a ghost of, the colonial dream of utopia. So it was already feeling the effects of the dystopic potential that it had ensconced within the discourse of urbanity since its very inception. And symptomatic of this dystopian vision is the problematization of the simplistic and systematic optimism that informs the utopian idealism by the hyperbolic and exaggerated explication of the underside of possibilities and essentially spoiling things for us by lending the readers a skeptical pair of glasses. So what postmodernism did was just lend us, a pair of glasses through which we can analyze the political desire invested in the modern state, which has considerably become deflated and diminished. And we are left with this, sprawling monstrosity of the ostensibly unified, topographically contained entity of a technocratic social landscape. And this is what reflects the most in postmodern fiction itself. So by triggering us off into a reflexive level of consciousness where idealism is displaced and totally dissipated by stark images of an absurd existence, dystopic imagination in this space is also kind of, a space to dream about simulacrums, because that is where we enter the literary tradition of the spatialization of postmodernism. So while postmodernism understands and acknowledges the the fields of power that went into this complicated spatial power relationships, it also wants to, understand space by shifting focus from its, physical reference to its psychological and functional. So spatiality came to be understood as a complex interrelation between functional and physical coefficients, with the functional being far more important for the status quo, while spaces that produce discourses of knowledge and power became the focal points of, theoretical research. And people understood more and more how to, grapple with the idea that we have been left with this space, yes, and, where we are ensconced in an interpretative geography. But on the other hand, this historico-geographical materialism, as Soya calls it, also has the potential of, being tinkered with and, the potential of being subverted, right? So this kind of postmodern specialization, which Soya also called the power-filled and problematic making of geographies, the enveloping and instrumental spatialization of society, is very evident in postmodern literature and postmodern narratives, right? I'm going to quote Soya a little bit so that we understand what he's talking about. He says, I quote, "The illusion of opaqueness reifies space, inducing a myopia that sees only a superficial materiality, concretized form susceptible to little else but measurement and phenomenal description. Alternatively, the illusion of transparency dematerializes space into pure ideation and representation, an intuitive way of thinking that equally prevents us from seeing the social construction of effective geographies, the concretization of social relation embedded in spatiality, and interpretation of space as a concrete abstraction." Right. So the spatial turn in postmodernism suggested that the historical forces and discourses of power that had once produced spaces were now being produced by space. This is where I think the subversion takes place clearly, especially because the postmodern era gradually became expert at producing spaces that never existed. Right. So the postmodern articulates spatiality exactly on these terms, right? The space of the city, space of the mind, space of the body, space of the text itself, which is why the body of the book became an extremely potent, discourse in itself in the postmodern term, as well as the fifth, the absence of, right? So not only are we dealing, therefore, for in post-modern space with the ephemeral or the fugitive or the contingent, where one could experience both the phantasmagoria of apparently infinite variety and perpetual movement, but also its exact opposite of being incarcerated and paralyzed, right? So from the flaneur in Walter Benjamin or Michel de Certeau, we have, a narrative like Don DeLillo's Cosmopolis, where the young hero's odyssey through the city is as much a product of his relationship to his space as his refusal to conform to the inner life of the city. He travels in a bulletproof, noise-proof limousine, a veritable urban chariot, as anti-capitalist riots wage like epic battles around him. The space of the city here no longer belongs to the indolent flanner roaming through the labyrinth of merchandise, but has been converted into an epic space where the urban sprawl transforming the space of the entire globe is happening at an accelerated pace and a vast scale, right? So just like DeLillo, we have other examples of postmodern fiction's ability to undertake this evolution in the techniques of evoking and articulating space. And it's largely due to its post-structural linguistic stance, forever looking to deconstruct received signifiers and reconstitute their meanings, just like it received the signifier of the utopia, but completely deconstructed and reconstituted its meaning. So space is a language postmodernists have inherited from modernism, but its relentless technological spirit has made postmodernism interpret it using a completely different lexicon, uh, as well as, it has subsumed other fields and other discourses apart from just linguistics itself. So the imagination of space, for instance, in the sciences, came very close to the postmodern's interpretation, as Henry Lefebvre explains. And I also want to quote a little bit of Lefebvre here to explain what I mean. So Lefebvre says in one of his essays that, I quote, the mathematicians appropriated space and time and made them part of their domain, yet they did so in a rather paradoxical. They invented spaces, an indefinity, so to speak, of spaces, non-Euclidean spaces, curved spaces, x-dimensional spaces, even spaces with an infinity of dimensions, spaces of configuration, abstract spaces, spaces defined by deformation or transformation of a topology, and so on. At once highly general and highly spatialized, the language of mathematics set out to discriminate between and classify all these innumerable spaces, the set of spaces or space of spaces, which did not lend itself readily to conceptualization. The space was no longer, you can see, just an extension of bodies, a la, Descartes, or space not as a Newtonian absolute or a fixed entity, right? So space as in a space that can be produced, that is outside the scope of mathematics, outside the scope of any kind of theory or theorem or any kind of fundamentally relational formula that existed before that. So this understanding of space is very, very new and very, very special to postmodernism. The fact that its epistemology has inherited and adopted the notion that the state of space is is not just mental, but potentially limitless in its physical form or in infinite variation. It could have infinite variations of interpretations, right? So in the postmodern idiom, the philosophical space interacts with the social space, where language becomes practice, engaging with both the logico-mathematical paradigms of infinite space, as well as the empirical space that produced and is produced by linguistic elements, right? It adopts attributes and it adopts attributes and properties of space as articulated both by scientific rationalist discourses as well as socio-historical, political, linguistic power discourses, and kind of amalgamates them, right? To use and to simultaneously, deconstruct them. So these kind of spatial margins, margins of not only text but discourses, has achieved a deconstruction of certain kinds of aporias uh, that were inherited by postmodernism. So to deconstruct a piece of writing also in postmodernism is therefore to operate a kind of reversal. And these margins became more and more articulate modern space. One, example of a story which is scribbled upon the margins of another story, right? So just give me a moment. I really want to. I think Lost in the Fun House. It was Lost in the Fun House, and what happened was after the very famous postmodern author David Foster Wallace had just, started writing his collection of short stories. And after Wallace started writing, he he wanted to write a story, but by continuously referring to John Barth's novel. And what he finally came up with was a story that was scribbled on the margins of Barth's original writing. And it was phenomenal. This postmodern idiom absolutely destroyed the meaning of narrative space. Because working at the margins, the practice of everything, including discursiveness, discursive power of languages, the practice of cartography, the concept of utopia, everything turns upside down because there is this radical disruption of a semiological system that has been inherited in our world. And this kind of, empowers postmodernism with this certain, spatial practices to sort of, subvert certain spatial practices as inherent in the empirical world. And this is how it dismantles received mythologies and creates new spatial mythologies. So this is one of those, places where it also uses mythic time. But unfortunately, in this lecture, I've only, chosen to speak about postmodern space. And so I'll come back to, what kind of real heterotropic spaces is Foucault talking about, and what kind of, building, thinking, what kind of subspaces, embedded and containment of those spaces, etc., happens in postmodernism, right? So let's come back to the concept of the simulacra, right? The place of the perpetual, the infinite mythic heterotopia, according to Foucault, which by definition should be connected to other times or heterochronias or other spaces. Right? This is the space of the postmodern, according to Foucault, according to Baudrillard, where its fiction is posited, as it is both real and abstract at the same time. It is real in the way its readers receive it and make meaning within it. And like Foucauldian heterotopias, can conceive the super space as a set of relationships that define sites that are irreducible to each other, right? Even while allowing them, unlike in heterotopias, to be reconstituted and palimpsestically superimposed on other spatialities or textualities, like mythologies would. So in this case, I would want to call them, these spaces more than heterotopias. I would call them mythographic spaces, right? Because I also am very, very sensitive to this postmodern mythologies of the simulacral aspect, right? Because defamiliarized mythographic heterotopias is what I feel the postmodern liminal imaginary is all about. Because when you read, Borges, when you read Calvino, this is exactly what happens when you read Midnight's Children. So all these, historical spatial contingencies that these authors, mm, conjure in their narratives, they have consumed multitudes inside their, which are jostling and shoving, and uh, disunity amongst them. So for example, Invisible Cities, night after night and day after day, Marco Polo is sitting in front of Kubla Khan and imagining different specialities. And at the end of the book, we can come to know that these 50 or 53 images of the cities that he describes during his travels are all images of Venice, right? So this disunity itself makes it so palpable in its difference as well as so ephemeral in its reality. That yes, all of them are Venice, but none of them are Venice. And the same thing happens in, Midnight's Children. In Midnight's Children, I have my, all-time favorite, imagery of speciality, where I don't know if people here remember this, but while discussing how their parents met, Salim Sinai discusses this strange incident where his doctor father came and had to examine his mother through a perforated sheet, right? So that no other part of this woman was visible. So the rest of it is imagined, it is an imagined space, while the perforated sheet is the focal point of the real, right? So the perforated sheet thereby implicated at the very center of the discourse of the individual and the nation space, because it is instrumental to the very history uh, of the very history of its birth space because Salim Sinai's mother and father meet at that point, the entry point of this grand narrative of national imaginary, since it embodies also the author's fantastical interaction with the rest of his imagined mother, his imagined homeland, in fact. And imaginary homelands is actually very significantly one of Rushdie's other writings. So, whether it's the space of the nation as an embodied presence, whether it is the space of a city as, a million different simulacras, the phantasmagorical uh, speciality of postmodern fiction is absolutely haunting in its significance. So just like the speciality of modernity stands for this utopian dream, the mythographically imagined spaces are perfectly aligned with the duplication and multiplication of the postmodern era. uh, you know uh, uh, a very very incredible thing that happened when I was reading Calvino's Invisible Cities, for instance, is that we come across this map, the atlas owned by the Great Khan, right? Several times in quick succession, this is mentioned. I want to quote from the book for a bit. The Great Khans owns an atlas where all the cities of the empire and the neighboring realms are drawn, building by building and street by street, with walls, rivers, bridges, harbors, cliffs. And then again, within a few paragraphs, it is mentioned, I quote, the Great Khans owns an atlas whose drawings depict the terrestrial globe all at once, and continent by continent, the borders of the most distant realms, the ship's routes, the coastlines, the maps of the most illustrious metropolises and of the most opulent ports. And again, within a few paragraphs, the Great Khan owns an atlas in which are gathered the maps of all the cities. This is so beautiful, right? Because the atlas is postmodern narrative itself. So within the atlas are the multiple simulacral continents, the multiple simulacral cities, and the multiple simulacral spaces, which on the one hand rest on the solid foundation of language, and on the other hand which, also fall to ruin and are swallowed up by this same language, right? So I would like to, I'm very aware that my time is kind of running out. I don't want to take a lot of time, but I will end with, what this means for the deconstruction of the logos and its subsequent replacement with multiple visions, multiple worlds, and multiple perspectives. What happens is that we finally are at an age which, in postmodernism, we were at an age where it heralded, its understanding and anticipation of space heralded the era of the hyperreal and hyperspace and hypertext. So within postmodern, we could actually see spaces making space for other spaces, the finite making space for the infinite, right? And just like we now open Wikipedia and without second thought, one of those blue words takes us to another page and then another page and another. This kind of hyperreal spatialization could only have been achieved with the new understanding that the postmodern gave us about, simulated spaces, the restructuring of the urban imaginary, and how specialities do not need to be, limited to the physical itself. So the echoes of the hyperreal, the echoes of virtual reality and artificial intelligence, etc., were already more real in postmodern than reality itself. So it kind of, went ahead and anticipated all of this before we had even, entered the era of virtual intelligence. And it's very important for us to understand this desanctification of space, that perhaps began with Galileo's work, where he said that no, space is not organized this way, space is organized this way. The desanctification of, modernity, the project of urban, colonial empires, this was so very, important to, to kind of accommodate the excesses of the world to which we now belong, so that it doesn't always get divided into the dualistic, you know, dualistic domains of private, public, sacred, profane, etc. So and as well as, these non-places have a place in this spatial abundance that we have in the proliferating geographies in postmodern fiction, or the post-metropolises, as they are kind of now known as. So I will end my lecture here, and I don't know if you are allowing questions or interactions, but I would like to hand the dice over to Trisha.
Yes, ma'am. We will be accepting questions after Dr. Basu's speech. Also, thank you
Sure.
so much, ma'am, for that informative and yet very interesting deliberations that you shared with us. And for our next speaker, we have Dr. Monikinkili Basu. And for most of us present here, I'm sure that she doesn't need any introduction. But pertaining to the decorum of leadership talks, I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Basu has completed her PhD from the prestigious Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Jadavpur University. She has a background in the humanities and film studies from the University of Kalyani, with over a decade of teaching experience at Sri Krishna College and the Bhawanipur Education Society. She specializes in theatre studies, performance studies, masculinity studies, and film studies. She is the examiner for multiple universities and has contributed significantly to the digitized learning schemes of the UGC. Currently, she is pursuing a course in the moral foundations of politics. She has taught courses on gender studies, cultural studies, and British and non-British European drama. Her present area of interest is the development of film posters and life studies. She is at present the head of the Department of English at Sister Nivedita University. Today, she is going to talk about space and power in postmodern film posters. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Trisha, for the formal introduction. I would request Trisha if she could share the photographs that I have shared with her. Actually, today I had a very wonky connection, internet connection, so I thought that it is better I'll send it to her because if by chance I cannot present my screen. So we'll just look at the photographs while we talk. And after what Gargidi has said, I don't think my lecture stands a place because I myself I am so engrossed in what Dr. Bhattacharya has said. I was so happy to hear her, and I have multiple uh, observations which I will talk about later, maybe. So now we move on to the aspect that I am going to cover today. And I'm going to basically talk about a very narrowed down area, that is space and power dynamics in postmodern film poster designs. And I have made a visual analysis kind of from the posters of 1980 to 2000. I've taken a very narrow zone because it is very difficult, every year there are multiple films that are being released, and every film has 2 to 3 posters coming up with it. So to be very specific, to point out to a particular poster in point, what I have done is I have talked about certain posters, and for the ease of looking at those particular posters, I have presented in front of you a collection of those posters that I intend to talk about. Now, through the close analysis of the key examples from mainstream and independent cinema, this particular study will demonstrate how postmodern poster design both critiques and reproduces the traditional power structures through the innovative use of space, scale, and perspective. Now, film posters serve as a crucial paratext that mediate between cinematic works and their audiences, encoding complex messages about power, authority, and social relations through their visual rhetoric. The postmodern turn in poster design during the 1980s and 1990s using fragmented composition, visual strategies that mirror broader cultural transformations of the era, actualization of power as operating through a spatial arrangement and visual regimes, as well as Jameson's theories of postmodernism, as characterized by spatial rather than temporal modes of representations. So, additionally, when we look at Kress and Lewin's social semiotic approach to visual analysis, it provides a methodological tool for examining how compositional elements construct meaning and power relations. Now, let us look at this poster of Brazil, which is on the screen right now. The emergence of this multi-panel and fragmented layout in 1980s film poster reflects postmodern skepticism towards a centralized authority. For example, the poster for Brazil, as you can see, this was a 1985 film, deliberately fractures space into competing zones of visual interest, undermining the traditional centered compositions that privilege singular protagonists. Similarly, the poster for Blade Runner, now this is 1982. Can we go to the second one? Yes. So, Blade Runner is it employs a kind of a complex layering of visual elements that creates multiple points of entry and resists a hierarchical reading. So there is no end to it. It's like a continuum, and manipulation of the scale becomes a key strategy for representing power dynamics in postmodern poster designing. And this again is 1982. When we move ahead and we look at the poster for Blue Velvet, which was 1986, I have taken one particular poster. Blue Velvet had multiple posters released at the same time, ideally. And 1986, this juxtaposes the extreme close up with distant perspectives. And what it is creating is an unsettling spatial relationship that mirrors the film's exploration of power beneath the suburban surfaces. So this approach makes a departure from classical Hollywood posters' use of predictable size hierarchies to denote star power. And postmodern posters, as you frequently might have understood from what postmodernism mostly talks about, is it is employing the unusual perspectives and viewing angles, and challenges the traditional subject oriented relationship. So the poster for Sex, Lies, and Videotape 1989, if you look at it, the next one, yes. So this one has an oblique angle and fragmented composition to destabilize the viewer's point of authority. While once again, if you look at Pulp Fiction, most people can compare between this one and the one that we can use for Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction is deliberately flat. There is a space that creates a collage like effect that resists a single point perspective. And when you resist a single point perspective, what happens is that it obviously, this was 1994, so we can take up a few case studies, like for example the famous The Matrix 1999. We can take up the Matrix poster and we can look at how the culmination of the postmodern spatial strategy is being elaborated in it. It's a primary poster, combines the vertical Japanese texts, as you can see, cascading digital code and multiple figure scales to create a complex spatial hierarchy that simultaneously suggests both an oppressive systematic power hierarchy and the possibility of a resistance. So, the design's integration of global cultural signifiers and technological aesthetics exemplifies the postmodern hybridization. Also, if you have noticed the color, the use of green and red, so the evolution of spatial strategies in postmodern film posters reveal broader cultural shifts in understanding power relations. Where classical Hollywood posters relied on stable hierarchies and clear power dynamics, postmodern designs embrace ambiguity, fragmentation, and multiple reading positions. So, as we can identify, ambiguity, fragmentation, and multiple reading positions is something that we have already today heard about while we are looking at a text from multiple dimensions. So similarly, if you look at the poster as a text, you are already bringing in the same element of identity of the age, the postmodern, the concept of the postmodern into this particular aspect. Now, this shift parallels larger postmodern critiques of authority and meta narrative, while paradoxically creating new visual conventions. So, therefore, the analysis of the spatial composition in postmodern film posters reveal a sophisticated strategy for representing and questioning the power relations. These designs both reflect as well as contribute to the changing cultural understanding of authority, resistance, and social organization. So, very important terms here would be social organization, resistance, and authority, because you can see they are mostly talking about the meta narratives that are being created out of it. So, if you are the parallel shift of larger critique of authority and meta narratives are basically looking at these power struggles within the same dynamo. These designs both reflect and contribute to changing cultural understanding of authority, resistance, and social organization. Why? Because they further the research and that might examine how digital design tools have influenced spatial strategies in contemporary poster and how the approaches translate across global market. For this, we can also look at the poster of Vertigo. If it is there, yeah, I think, yeah, it is there. So Vertigo basically is a 1990 re-release poster. This re-release poster of Hitchcock's Vertigo was designed by Saul Boss, and it represents a very significant postmodern reinterpretation of the film's theme through the concept of spatial dynamics. And Boss's minimalist spiral design creates a kind of a destabilizing visual effect. So if you look at the poster, it almost reminds you of the concept of yin yang, and it is like a never ending loop. And in that never ending loop, the concept of vertigo is also established, which is of course, of spatial dynamics. And we are looking at the main thematic idea of the film through the motive of the yin yang. And we are looking at a destabilizing visual effect that pulls the viewer's eyes into an endless recursive loop. And this spatial strategy directly challenges the conventional movie poster hierarchy. It eliminates the character representation entirely in favor of a pure geometric abstraction. So, because it is an abstract, once again, it is a challenge to the concept of vertigo, which is not very mainstream. The poster's use of negative space, number one, and stark colors. Contrast that exemplifies what Baudrillard terms as hyperreal, where representation becomes more significant than the thing that is being represented. I think this would take us to the concept of what we are talking about, and we can also go into the concept of the nothingness of space. And then we come to maybe another case study, which is in my case, I've taken Natural Born Killers. This is a very interesting poster of the 1994 Natural Born Killers. I'm sure some of you have already seen the contrasting colors, the use of red, pink, black, green, and of course yellow is very interesting. And this is the theatrical poster for Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, and it demonstrates how postmodern design can critique media representation through spatial fragmentation. The poster's composition splits the space into a television like frame, if you look at it, each containing distorted images of the protagonist. So these are not really, this very straight, normal narrative of a poster. It's a little distorted. If you look at the angles in which the write up has been put up in yellow, you will find that it almost is like it's as if the two figures in red at the background, they are almost supernatural. So the implication is a little problematic. And the spatial strategy that creates is what Deleuze and Guattari would term as a rhizomatic structure, where power flows through multiple non-hierarchical entry and exit points. Am I audible, everyone? Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we
thought
can
I
all
had-
hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So, the design's deliberate violation of traditional grid systems reflects the film's, let's say, broader critique of the media violence and the celebrity culture. So, because it deals with the subject is being, fragmented in its own way. Now, coming to 1999's famous Fight Club, which has been, the Bible for many a generation of fight films and the Angry Young Man heroes. And 1999, this was the primary poster campaign, which was being done using this particular poster because it exemplifies postmodern spatial subversion through the manipulation of corporate aesthetic conventions. Interestingly, the design appropriates the visual language of a luxury soap advertising using negative space and centered composition to create a initial impression of the order and authority. So, however, this you see that there are subtle elements of chaos and destruction that intrude upon the ordered space, creating what Derrida would call the déphero, a visual tension between the presence and the absence. This spatial strategy mirrors the film's theme of consumerist culture and the underground resistance. So the presentation and the obscure coloring of the soap is somewhat a slap on the face of visual designs. And obviously, you can look at the consumerist culture and it is, of course, standing out. That is what is very important. Let us come to Strange Days. This is 1995. Strange Days, of course, as you know, as you've seen perhaps, that it employs what we can, in language of Frederick Jameson, talk about as the cognitive mapping in its representation of the technologically mediated power relations. So yes, when Bigelow talks about Strange Days or presents Strange Days posters, the design it uses is a multiple layer of reality. It's physical and virtual. It's represented through overlapping spatial planes. Now, the overlap is very interesting because, of course, it is done in a very unapologetical overlapping space. So, and of course, when you are looking at this kind of an overlapping of spatial plane, the poster's vertical orientation and the downward spiraling composition suggest surveillance and immersion. So, while the fragmented figure placement disrupts the traditional narrative reading patterns, this spatial organization reflects the film's theme of technical control and mediated experience. Now we come to a more liberating poster, that of Thelma and Louise, which is a 1991 poster. And here we can compare it with the one of Basic Instinct. So we have Basic Instinct, of course, 1992, and Thelma and Louise is 1991. They reveal a contrasting approach to representing the gender power dynamics through spatial composition, of course. And the Thelma and Louise poster employs a horizontal expansion and its open space to suggest a liberation from the patriarchal constraints. So obviously the colors, the concept of the open sky, the openness of the car, the space being not being constricted space. And when we are looking at the concept of Basic Instinct, which uses vertical oppression and a compression of thought and a claustrophobic framing to explore power through sexuality and constraint, because of course the concept of sexuality runs very deep in these two films. Both designs reflect what Laura Mulvey in 1989 had identified as a tension between the female agency and the objectification in cinema. So the next aspect that we can take up is that of the film Pi. Pi in 1998 was marked as a very crucial transition in poster design. Now, why? Because it was here that digital tools enabled complex manipulation of space. And the poster of Pi was perhaps one of the best examples of a digitally made poster that used mathematical patterns and digital distortion and created what Catherine Hales in 1999 terms as the informational spaces. So you have all the information in the poster, but it is encrypted. It is encrypted in order to create a kind of exclusion. So you are welcome to look at the poster, but the poster is not really giving away a lot of information or a lot of insight into the film. Now we can go to a more a very different kind of a film, which is a Truman Show. The Truman Show 1998 uses a nestled frame and recursive sort of imagery to represent surveillance and mediated reality, anticipating contemporary concerns about digital privacy and control. These case studies demonstrate, somehow the postmodern poster design, and that is what it is talking about. It is basically moving away from terms like legitimate taste of classical composition towards more fragmented and contested spatial arrangements. So the evolution of these design strategies reflect broader cultural shift in understanding power relations, media representations, and perhaps even technological mediations. The transformation of the film poster design from 1990 to 2005 once again presents a very fascinating case study with and what Foucault could have termed as, or we can relate to Foucault's term as, the heterotopia. So, space that simultaneously represent, contest, and invert the dominant cultural arrangement. Now, let us take David Fincher's Fight Club. Is that poster there? I don't remember. Uh, yeah, it is there. So yeah, so the flipping, yeah, so the same one I'm using here once again, because yeah, so it is there. We can go back to page. I can't see the screen. Is it there, Trisha, on screen?
Yes, I'm sharing the screen.
Yes,
Okay,
it's on
okay,
the
okay. Yeah,
screen.
yeah, I can see now. I
Fight
think
Club
there's
is
a
on the
wonky
screen.
internet. That is why it is causing a little bit of problem. Yeah, it is there on the screen. So if you look at Fight Club once again, where the fragmented typography and the destabilized spatial hierarchy directly challenges what Benjamin termed as the oratic quality of traditional movie marketing. So the poster's deliberate violation of the rule of thirds and integration of the subliminal elements creates what Roderick would call a digital event space. Now, one that collapses distinctions between surface and depth, representation and simulation, this spatial disruption finds theoretical grounding in, once again, the concept of smooth space or straighted space of deluge. Now, traditional Hollywood posters exemplifying straighted space would obviously look at the hierarchical ordered and serving institutional power through what Bordwell would have termed as intensified continuity. Now, intensified continuity is it's never ending. It's like goes on. And when you look at the poster of the famous 2000 film Memento, you look at the concept of continuity in a very proper way. If I think it's page 14 or 15.
Yes,
Yeah, Memento
it's
is
on
here.
screen.
Yeah. Thank you. So Memento, when we are looking at the postmodern designs like Matrix, Memento, they create smooth spaces that resist linear reading. Therefore, the fixed meaning is somewhere lost. The Matrix's poster, digital rain effect, and the fractured imagery exemplify what Hansen had called as new philosophy for new media, right? But visual strategies that acknowledge the viewer's embodied engagement with these digital interfaces is often mixed with what Manovich terms as the deep remixability in poster design that parallels a broader change in cinema's relationship to power and spectatorship. Now, considering Darren's Requiem for a Dream, Requiem for a Dream poster was perhaps one of the most uh, disturbing posters that I have, one of the most disturbing posters that I have seen of this particular genre and this era. Requiem for a Dream for in 2000, in the year 2000, was a vertical splitting and recursive frame, creating what Sobchak calls as the phenomenological space. Now, this design that demands an active perpetual engagement rather than a passive consumption aligns with Rancier's concept of the emancipated spectator. Now, the emancipated spectator participates in the meaning making rather than receiving the pre-digested signification. So, Requiem for a Dream basically uh, can mean for you something. For me, it can mean something. It can mean panopticon, it can mean threat, it can mean the person's whose photograph is there below it. It is the person's eyes and the pathos associated with the close up. So it can mean multiple things. So that is where we are talking about the concept of cultural logic of late capitalism. We are basically the design innovations that reflect. Jameson has identified these design innovations as the cultural logic of late capitalism, where spatial fragmentation mirror the dispersed nature of the contemporary power structure, right? So the increasing use of digital distortion layered imagery, non-linear compositional strategies in film posters. These speak to what Baudrillard terms as the hyperreality, as you have already heard, where representation precedes and determines the real. The theoretical implications extend beyond the film studies into a broader question of visual culture and power. So, as Marx argues, that designs create a haptic visuality, and it engages multiple perpetual, let's say, registers. It challenges the dominance of what Laura Mulvey termed as the male gaze through the fragmentation and the spatial ambiguity. Okay. Now, this shift from optical to haptic visuality parallels what Hansen describes as the post-cinematic affection image. Now, this post-cinematic affection image, there is a design strategy that acknowledges the embodied multi-sensory nature of contemporary media consumption. Therefore, when we look at the spatial politics of postmodern film poster designs, it reveals a complex negotiation between institutional power, number one, number two, spectatorial agency, number three, and the last one, technological mediation. So these three: institutional power, spectatorial agency, and technological mediation. So these works do not simply market films, they constitute what Michel calls as the meta picture. Okay, and images that theorize their own nature while questioning established regimes of representation. As we move deeper into the digital age, we are going to understand that the spatial strategies become crucial for analyzing how visual culture both reflects and reshapes the power relations in these contemporary society. Okay, that's it.
All right.
I've made up time that Gargidi has taken. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Okay, done.
So do you have any questions for our speakers? Any of you? You can just type it in the chat box or you can ask them yourself. Do you have any of the speakers who would like to comment on each other's deliberations?
I want to apologize. I was under the impression that I had an hour for the lecture. I'm so sorry.
Going
No,
by
It
ma'am.
is only when you said that I overshot. I was like,
it
was
is
I
very
not
that you've
supposed to have
spoken for an
spoken for
hour.
an hour? I was so relieved that I was like under the, time limit. I was so happy with myself and giving myself a pat on the back. I'm like, wow, for a change, you have not gone over the limit. And then lo and behold, I have.
No, it's perfectly fine because, I talk to my students on and off in the class, but listening to you, I'm sure they have gained a lot. And especially because we have PG3 and research scholars here. So I'm really glad that you have taken the time and given us such a nice lecture. I believe Sir is there, Shubhi Sir. Is Sir there, or I don't know.
Yes, he is here.
He's not
I
unmuting
think he
himself.
scared people.
Never mind. If there are no questions, then maybe we can have the session because it's recorded. So we can share it with
I had a question.
Okay.
Yes, I'm very sorry. I got temporarily disconnected. Is there a Q&A going on?
Yeah.
Lovely. I have a network issue, which is why I'm not switching on my video. My apologies. I had a question for Gargidi. First of all, wonderful presentation, and I just loved every bit of it.
Thank you so much.
You covered majority of the aspects. I just had a quick question regarding memory.
Yeah.
So, what is the role of collective memory in creating such spaces? Because you talked about because you were talking about I believe desanctification of space. So, if you can kindly discuss a couple of minutes about that.
Yes, so great question actually, because one of my chapters, so this is largely kind of a summarization of one of the chapters of my thesis, and I deal with postmodern time as well. So collective memory comes in more, collective and individual memory, trauma, come in postmodern more than space. Uh, in how painful fail to comprehend or respond to horrific adult realities. For example, narratives of slavery, narratives of the Holocaust, the reverse kind of collective memory actually has a huge role, especially in the articulation of postmodern trauma, because they are, beyond the space of the scene, the identifiable or the physical manifestation of spaces. So yes, they will slide into the space of the myth. And this mythology is very, very, crucial to the understanding of postmodern space. That which cannot be articulated. See, you have to understand that in these cases, uh, memory is somewhere it somewhere serves a more important role, that is witnessing. So we say that sometimes when memory adapts into this collective anguish of a nation or a people, it leaves a deep spatial gash on the skin of narratives. So that is kind of where it belongs, and it is extremely disruptive. A great example would be Beloved, which is one of my favorite postmodern novels of all time, where you can see that a mother who has been forced to kill her child because she had escaped, and there was a chance that they would be taken back to slavery, and the fear of a child growing up as a slave, she preferred instead to kill the child. And then the ghost of this child keeps coming back, keeps reappearing throughout this novel. And this trauma is articulated only as a spectral presence, a ghost. And a ghost does not take space, and yet a ghost takes space, right? So
Yes.
speciality of this kind of memory is always in the form of this haunting, which you hear underneath the actual real words. And another manifestation in the same novel, it's absolutely brilliant. Toni Morrison, she was a giant. And what happened was, after this girl was killed, her mother could only pay the grave maker for like this one word. She said, I will sleep with you. Instead, you can, write on the grave, dearly beloved, whatever, in Christian terms. And the only word that the grave maker wrote was beloved. This is why the name of the child ghost as well as the novel becomes Beloved. So that one linguistic sign, though, that one signifier, beloved, that comes to represent not only what her lost child means to her, but what millions of these children have meant to history. They're a spectral presence, they're a ghost, they're haunted, right? So I guess we could go on and on about it, but I guess
Yes,
your
exactly.
question has been answered.
Absolutely so. I do realize, because due to paucity of time, you probably did not want to delve into that wormhole of memory and spaces. But yes,
No, I
thank you
did.
so
I did delve into the wormhole, and it took one whole chapter of my PhD thesis to deal with that
much.
wormhole. There are thousands of examples. There's the
Yes,
tin drum,
absolutely.
where the boy cannot articulate because it's about Holocaust. You see that there is a very keen personal and political deadlock. This cannot be
Right.
sorted because it lies beyond the realm of the Russian. And that which lies beyond the space of the rational is also very difficult to deal with linguistically. So most of them is not that articulate, but it is kind of, the idiom more like.
Yes.
Trisha, I think we can wrap today's lecture.
Yes, yes. So thank you so much. I would like to thank both of our speakers on behalf of
So
Deslu.
before we wrap up, Moni Kinkini, I really absolutely enjoyed your presentation because I'm a film buff and I studied film studies. I will definitely request you to go take a look of the designs of Noma Bar.
Yes,
I
that in
posted
itself can
just
be
a
a
few days back.
presentation, Nomabad.
Yes, that itself can be a presentation. And the
Working
use of
on that,
negative
but
space
that
especially.
is too big
It's
for a
absolutely
half an hour
brilliant.
presentation, so I did not
You
include
can
that.
do one because the Brazil
This
poster
will be
is
a
so,
one and a half
wonderful.
hour look at
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
I will
you can just
definitely
definitely expand on this, especially the retro
Absolutely.
punk genres, because the
Oh
newer retro
God,
punk has
yes.
even better posters, but Brazil is so, interesting
Yes,
because it
absolutely.
started
And
all of this.
also, I was thinking, Gargidi, of looking at the Japanese film posters uh,
Absolutely, absolutely,
of the postmodern
absolutely.
era, because that is so unexplored and that is so open to interpretation. So I'll definitely look into
It,
that. Thank you.
it,
Thank you so much.
Trisha, can I put in a word?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
I'm here. Ischin, I'm
No,
here.
I think there was
there
some
throughout.
problem. You could not switch on your microphone.
Yeah,
I was calling out for you.
I know. Anyway, may I say that I think, we have a wonderful set of 2 lectures today. And I frankly found both presentations extremely elucidating, extremely interesting. And in a word, I think, I have nothing but applause for both of you. Thank you so much for making this a wonderful section.
Thank you so much, sir. We're very grateful. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
sir.
Okay, so thank you both of our speakers for giving us such an insightful Monday afternoon. And I would like to remind our audience also that today is our last literature talks for this year. We'll be back again on January. Until then, I would like to have, thank again you guys and thank you so much.